Genshin Impact's most recent 5.3 Lantern Rite event saw Yunjin deliver an opera performance for the first time since 2.4, which was all the way back in January of 2022. However, compared to her famous debut performance, The Divine Damsel of Devastation, her performance this year, The Sanctification of Tao Do, seems to have left a lot of excited fans confused. Yunjin performs the opera twice, but the two versions sound very different from each other, leaving many players wondering how we suddenly went from this to this. The second version may sound a bit weird, but it's not because Hoyo decided to cut the production budget. Today, I'll be breaking down Yunjin's second version of The Sanctification of Tao Do and introducing some of the Chinese opera elements behind it. But before we begin, I'd just like to say I am not a Chinese opera professional or anything like that. Chinese opera is a very complex art, and what I say in this video is from my limited knowledge as just a student who enjoys Chinese opera. If you ever want to learn more about Chinese opera, I'm sure there are much better sources online from people who actually know what they're talking about. Now with that out of the way, let's get into it. Before we take a look at Yunjin's performance itself, let's first take a look at some background information. Chinese opera is a traditional Chinese theatre form that combines drama, music, dance, and martial arts together, and it's not just one thing. In fact, there are hundreds of different regional variants and styles of Chinese opera, each with their own unique histories, cultures, and performance methods. Yunjin's design and character is heavily based on Jingju, or in English, Peking or Beijing opera, which is a form of Chinese opera originating from Beijing. Peking opera is the most popular and famous type of Chinese opera, and it's usually the first one that comes to mind when people hear the word Chinese opera. Now going back to Yunjin, her second version of The Sanctification of Tao Do is actually more Chinese opera-like than her first version, or The Divine Damsel of Devastation. And that's because, in this second version, she's actually singing real Chinese opera. Like, if I listened to her second performance without knowing that it was from a game, and someone told me it was from an opera, I would 100% believe them. Her singing follows traditional music theory, rhythms, and patterns Peking opera follows, which is why it may sound so unfamiliar to non-Chinese listeners. Although Yunjin's first version of The Sanctification of Tao Do and The Divine Damsel of Devastation contain musical elements of Chinese opera, beyond that, they don't really resemble real Chinese opera at all. Those two songs can be classified as gufengqu, or ancient-style music, which is a Chinese popular music genre that combines Chinese popular music techniques with Chinese opera techniques. If you liked these two songs, then I highly recommend you check this genre out. Yunjin begins her performance by doing what is called a Nianbai. Nianbai refers to the spoken parts of Chinese opera compared to the sung parts. Nianbai includes dialogues, monologues, and involves the actor using different techniques and movements to achieve different effects. Nianbai can be used to express a character's deep emotion. Or provide context or information for the audience. Or even add a little bit of comedy to the scene. Yunjin's Nianbai provides some context for the audience, and she does another Nianbai in the middle of the song to create some contrast with her singing. She did this with the Divine Damsel of Devastation too, and one of her voice signs when she joins the party is also a Nianbai. Speaking of voice, let's talk about Yunjin's voice. Characters in Chinese opera can be generally categorized into 4 roles: Shen, Dan, Jing, and Chou. Each role has their own set of rules on how to move, how to sing, or how to do anything on stage, and can be further divided into many more subtypes. Yunjin is based on the Dan role, and aside from her design, the most obvious way is to tell from her voice. Apart from one subtype, all Dan roles use a kind of falsetto voice on stage. There are different techniques to talk or sing using this Dan voice, depending on the school and the type of Dan the actor is playing. A poor widow in mourning might talk like this, while a cherry maidservant might sound like this. But not all roles talk using a falsetto voice. Some Shen and all Jing roles use a deeper and rougher voice, and all Chou roles usually use their real voice. Another feature of Yunjin's voice that players learning Chinese may have noticed is her style of speech, namely her pronunciation. One of the reasons why Chinese opera is sometimes difficult for even native speakers of Chinese to understand is because the Chinese opera is performed in isn't everyday spoken Chinese. For example, here is a line from the Peking opera The Unicorn Purse, and in everyday spoken conversational Mandarin, it's read like this. 薛妈，我来问你，己酉年6月18日，天气如何？你还记得吗？ However, in the opera itself, it's read like this.
薛妈，我来问你，己酉年6月18日，天气如何？你还记得吗？
If we compare these two readings together, you'll see that some words are pronounced completely differently, and that the tones are also different. Chinese operas are normally performed in some form of classical Chinese, normally in the dialect of its region of origin. The stage speech of Peking opera evolved from Zhongzhou Ring, or Zhongzhou Rhyme in English, which was a stage speech developed from the official court language of the area between the Yellow River and the Luo River. Peking opera stage speech is based on the Beijing dialect, but also contains features from the Hubei, Anhui, and Jiangsu dialects, which is why Yunjin sounds like she's speaking Mandarin, but not. Chinese opera characters also tend to use traditional wording and sometimes speak in archaic poetry styles, which makes it even harder to understand when they start singing. Unlike her past performances, Yunjin's singing here follows a traditional Chinese opera musical structure. A core part of music in Chinese opera is what is called the vocal style. This refers to the system or framework of music that dictates the rhythm and techniques of the actors singing. There are a variety of different styles, each with many variations suitable for different purposes. A style can express a character's grace and elegance. Or capture the intensity of a high-stakes situation. Peking opera mainly uses two styles, CP style and Erhuang style. CP style tends to be fast, quick, and light, and is often used in a variety of plays for different purposes, such as narration, but it can be used for expressing emotions as well. Erhuang style, on the other hand, is much more slower, steady, and is commonly used to set a solemn or serious mood for the scene. which is why it's quite often used for tragedies or other plays that involve complicated topics or raw emotions such as love or grief. Yunjin here is singing in xipi sanban, or xipi scattered beat style, which is quite a free and unrestricted style that allows the singer to easily express deep emotion. Halfway through her performance, she changes to xipi kuaiban, or xipi fast beat style, which is often used to express heightened emotion like extreme excitement or anger during intense scenes of powerful emotion. Here's a comparison of Yunjin singing with Peking opera arias that share the same style. You may notice that although Yunjin's singing shares the same style as those opera arias, they don't sound exactly the same. Each style and variation has its own rules, and as long as the actor and the accompaniment stay within those rules, there is freedom to experiment and be creative. Let's take a look at an example. Those two arias may sound completely different from each other, but they are indeed both sung using CP flowing water style. Because the singer and the accompaniment are both working within the rules of the style, those two arias can both be considered to be CP flowing water style arias. Apart from singing, instruments are also an important part of Chinese opera music. If you pay close attention, you can hear in the background a type of instrument is being played to accompany Yunjin singing. This instrument is called the jinhu, which is a type of erhu used in Peking opera. Peking opera instruments can be separated into two types, orchestral instruments and percussional instruments. Some examples of orchestral instruments include the aforementioned jinhu, the rite or moon lute, and the sanxianqing or three-stringed lute. Percussional instruments include the guban, drum board, different kinds of luo or gongs, and naobo, cymbals. Orchestral instruments tend to be used in civil scenes to set a serious or peaceful mood for the story, whereas percussional instruments tend to be used in martial scenes to emphasize and complement the actor's actions. You can also hear percussional instruments in the background when Yunjin does her attack and skills. During the performance, the accompanists sit to the side of the stage, where they can clearly see the actors and what is happening on the stage. This is because the actors and musicians work closely together, listening and adjusting their singing and playing to each other. This is especially important in impromptu parts of Chinese opera, where cooperation and communication between both sides is essential. Another thing players may have noticed is that Yunjin does these jerks and suddenly stops moving. This is called liangxiang, or striking a pose, and is another important part of Chinese opera. Striking a pose is when the actor pauses for a few seconds, capturing the expression and emotions of the character. Actors may strike a pose when they enter or exit the stage to show the audience what kind of character is entering the story, or they may strike a pose to capture the emotional state of the scene. Striking a pose is considered an essential skill that all Chinese opera actors must learn to perfect. A good pose allows the audience to instantly recognize the actor and their character before they even speak or sing. Players may have noticed by now that Yunjin often uses hand gestures. She uses them in her idol and normal attack animations too. Yunjin uses lanhua shou, or orchid hand gestures, which are common hand gestures used by characters of the Dan role. Hand gestures are an important part of Chinese opera. They are used to express the character's intentions and emotions, so much so that the hands are sometimes referred to as the second face. Each role has their own special set of hand gestures, and each gesture carries a specific meaning. Here, Yunjin is doing a gesture called lanhua zhi, or orchid fingers, which is a common gesture used by Dan roles when they are pointing to someone or something. Some other gestures Yunjin uses are lanhua zhang, orchid palm, a gesture that symbolizes femininity, shuang shuang, or twin pair gesture, which often represents rejection or dislike, and an open palm, which is used to symbolize power and strength. It's a little hard to notice because of the restrictions from animation, but Yunjin also does these eye movements. Eye movement, like hand gestures, are another skill that helps Chinese opera actors express their character. The eyes can be used to express a variety of things. They can show a character's actions, such as adjusting their crown, or thinking of a clever plan. They can express emotions, such as shock or resolve, and they can also be used to show a character's personalities, such as a serious, mature nature, or a cheeky playfulness. I'm sure the developers tried to do something with Yunjin's eyes, but there's only so much you can do when you're limited by 3D model animation. Here, we see Yunjin's spear, which is a type of spear called a huaqiang, a common prop in Chinese opera. Weapon props in Chinese opera tend to be smaller and lighter than their real-life counterparts, so it's easier to move them around and use them for stunts and techniques. Yunjin's huaqiang is rather flat, and is a special type of huaqiang used for something called da chu shou, which is a technique performed by dan rolls often used in mythological martial scenes where characters fight with magic. Da chu shou involves the main character, called the shamba, standing in the middle surrounded by supporting actors called the xiaba. The xiaba throw these spears, the flat huaqiang, at the shamba in the middle, and the shamba deflects them either by hitting them or kicking them. Also, for some reason, Yunjin's Nianbai here is untranslated, so I'll just translate that real quick. In the second half of her singing, Yunjin's performance turns to resemble more of a martial dan performance, which will make sense in a couple of minutes. Remember how I mentioned that every role can be further divided into subtypes? In Peking opera, the dan role is commonly divided into 5 subtypes. Zhen dan, or proper dan, are dignified and mature female characters, often mothers or noble ladies. Hua dan, or flower dan, are lively girls, often younger and unmarried girls. Dao ma dan, or blade horse dan, are female warriors, usually horse-riding generals or commanders. Wu dan, or martial dan, are female characters skilled in combat who fight with all sorts of weapons. And lao dan, who are old and elderly women, and also the only dan to not use a falsetto voice. Martial dan mainly focus on stunts and acrobatics, but do sing as well. A lot of the flipping and spear spinning that Yunjin does in her performance are actually real martial dan moves from Chinese opera. Here is a comparison to get a better look. And that concludes the end of this video. It's always interesting to see how video games combine traditional cultures with modern media, and I'd say Genshin Impact did quite a good job with Yunjin. Hoyo really did their homework with this one. But anyways, that's all I've got to say. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for sticking around. It's my first time making a YouTube video, if you know what I mean, so please excuse the editing mistakes. If you're interested in Chinese opera, the internet is always a good place to start. There's quite a few videos on YouTube that cover the basics of Chinese opera, and if you're ever curious enough to watch a full Chinese opera, which are usually 2 hours long, they can go over. There are also playlists here on YouTube of Chinese operas with English subtitles. Thank you everyone for your support. Hopefully you learned something new today, and thank you for watching. Bye bye!